Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. Sorry, we were just doing a little mic check there. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for the webinar today. We're going to be talking about SBA's new ITVAR size rule. My name is John Williams. I'm one of the partners in PilieroMazza's Government Contracts Group, and I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Cy Alba, another one of our partners here in the Government Contracts Group. And both Cy and I have been with PilieroMazza about 10 years now, and like I said, we've both been in the Government Contracts Practice Group. It's one of several practice groups that we have here. For those that don't have a lot of familiarity with our firm, I definitely encourage you to check us out on our website, PilieroMazza.com. We have a lot of good content. In addition to webinars like this, we have weekly updates. We have a blog that's updated on an almost daily basis, a lot of other webinars and newsletters, and great content for government contracting and small business issues. So again, thanks for joining us, and please visit us on the web. So Cy and I have been tracking this IT value-added reseller size rule for a while now. It was the change that was recently finalized was first proposed, I think, over a year ago, and it's had a big impact. We think it's going to have a big impact for a number of our clients, and we've heard from a lot of people in the ITVAR industry that are concerned about it. And so our thought behind this webinar is that we want to share with everybody the history of this rule, give you some context for what the rule used to say and why it used to say that, and then talk about, well, what is the new rule? What exactly does the new rule mean? How are we going to be determining size for IT value-added resellers now? And what does that mean for you? And what it means, as you'll find out as we move through the presentation, is that we now have to pay a lot more attention to the SBA's non-manufacturer rule than we used to as IT value-added resellers. So we're going to walk you through what is the non-manufacturer rule and how do the waivers work for that rule. And then we'll wrap up with some thoughts on some policy issues that we see and, what should ITVARs do now? And our hope is that we'll get a lot of feedback from you all who have joined us. You can use the question feature and feel free to submit questions, but also feel free to submit comments because what we're hoping to do is to, when we get to the policy section, we already have some thoughts on some things that we think the SBA could look at, maybe Congress should look at to tweak or improve the rules and how this is going to function to make it more feasible and workable for IT value-added resellers. And we want to get your input on that too. And our thought is that we'll coalesce all of the good ideas and then submit them to SBA, maybe submit them on the Hill and try to get some positive changes on this, because we do see some real downsides and potential for adverse impact that maybe wasn't anticipated when this new rule was drafted, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So again, just really encourage your feedback. You email us afterwards if you don't want to submit a comment, but any thoughts that anyone submits, we're going to take into account and look to pass on to the powers that be. So with that, I want to turn it over to Cy to get us started on the first bit of content here, walking you through the history of the rule and where it is today.
Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for coming today. We really appreciate it, and hopefully you get a lot of good information, and then we can share together and, like John said, putting together a strategy and maybe helping each other through this. Just wanted to get started with some background, and the old ITVAR rule was put in place in 2002, and it was one of those rules where I'm sure people are very familiar with the NAICS code system, and SBA places size standards on each of the NAICS codes. And for certain ones, certain special codes that have some unique defining characteristic, they issue these footnotes where they put exceptions to those rules. And in 2002, SBA looked at this IT value-added reseller market and decided that that was one of the areas where there should be an exception to the rule. And instead of the $20 or so million size standard that existed back then, they decided to put a 150 employee size standard on ITVAR contracts. And that was basically because in the ITVAR world, there's a lot of products and materials that are being passed through that fall on your books for revenue purposes, and it doesn't directly correlate to the size of your company because it's just a pass-through expense. So SBA decided, rightly so, I think, to create this exception to 541519 to allow a 150 employee size standard for value-added resellers in the IT market. And some of the reasons why they did that is they said, well, the ITVAR market is specialized. It's one of those sort of rare instances where the services may not make up the largest portion of the value of the contract, but those services are of critical importance to the contract. Even though, let's say, out of $1 million contract, 800,000 or so might be for just the supplies that you're providing to do the work, that other 200,000 is critical. And so they put the exception in here to turn it from what was a service code into or to maintain rather the service code designation on there, despite the fact that it was predominantly for supplies. And this came up, or what SBA said, is that you could use this exemption when between 15 and 50% of the contract was for added services. So even though it might be, like I said, predominantly for supplies, you could use this footnote 18 to say that you were a small business so long as you were under a 150 employee size standard instead of the standard revenue-based size standard. And it also explicitly stated that because this is still considered a service code, that the non-manufacturer rule did not apply despite the fact that you would be using this footnote. And that's important to note kind of going forward. So then in 2014, SBA proposed a change to this ITVAR size rule. In particular, they noted that the rule was being used in ways they didn't necessarily anticipate. They thought that maybe too much of these contracts that were being set aside for small businesses under 541519, footnote 18, the exemption, was for really resale of large business software and products to an extent that they thought it wasn't necessarily really helping small businesses. It was just allowing a pass-through for large businesses to sell their products to the government under small business set-asides. And so there were various thoughts about how to correct this, and one of the proposed changes was to simply eliminate the 150 employee size standard and to simply revert back to the revenue-based size standard and just eliminate that footnote 18 exception entirely. SBA said that, aside from simply the exception being misused sort of on these pass-through contracts I mentioned, there were also inconsistencies and confusion out there in a variety of places. The government didn't necessarily understand how to identify the NAICS code exceptions in the federal procurement data system, so there wasn't good tracking of revenues. The Department of Commerce and Census couldn't necessarily track where these revenues were going and to what industries they were going to, because now you have this 541519, which is both services and this other exemption, which SBA considered services, but where the majority of the value was supplies. It caused confusion even at the Census and Commerce about how to track that. And then in addition, in the general marketplace with competitors and other small businesses, they would look at some of the data under 541519 footnote 18 and think that a lot of large businesses were getting small business contracts because they would look up these small businesses and look at their revenues, and they wouldn't necessarily understand that it was awarded under this footnote 18 under an employee-based size standard. And so that created various confusion and problems in the industry as well. And beside all that, there was always this tension with the fact that you're awarding a contract using a service code where more than 50% of the cost of the contract was going towards supplies. And I think in the intervening years between 2002 and 2014, that started to come to a head as maybe SBA saw how the exception was being used, and they thought that there must be a better way. And so they asked for comments going forward from small businesses about how to change this so it would be more equitable. So now we're here in 2016, and effective February 26th of this year, SBA issued its final rule on this point, taking into account the various comments from small businesses and others about whether or not to eliminate the 150 employee size standard. And SBA chose not to eliminate the 150 employee size standard. They are leaving footnote 18 in the 541519 NAICS code. So you can still use that exception to the revenue-based size standard for ITVAR contracts. However, the major change here, as John noted at the beginning, was that they said that the non-manufacturer rule applies to those contracts because in their reevaluation of this footnote 18, they decided that while the services are still important, just like as was articulated in 2002, that because the predominance of the value of the contract is really supplies, that this should be treated as a supply contract despite being under a service code. And that is really a 180-degree turn from where the SBA was in 2002. And some of the reasons they said, they basically walked back on some of the comments they made in 2002, saying that, well, these sorts of ITVAR contracts aren't really that special. A lot of contracts nowadays have mixed services and supplies, and so given that the rule about the preponderance of the contract, so if more than 50% is supplies, it's supplies. If more than 50% is services, it's services. That rule is already a very good rule, a solid rule, and it should be kept. And so because of that, then any 541519 procurement that uses the exception should be classified essentially as a supply contract, in which case the non-manufacturer rule would apply, and that would clear up a lot of the confusion, because then you wouldn't necessarily have people worrying about how do I do this? How is it classified as a small business set aside? What's the performance of work rules on something like this, where such a large portion of the contract is sort of discounted or ignored for purposes of things? And SBA thought this was a way to streamline things and make it clearer. And there's no doubt that the application of the non-manufacturer rule in certain circumstances would make things clearer, because now you know what you have to do. However, there are issues that come up with that in these sorts of circumstances, not the least of which is, well, as we have on the bottom of the slide, which size standard really applies here? Is it the non-manufacturer rule size standard, which is actually 500 employees, or is it still this 150 employee size standard? And that's one of the confusing things. And so in order to dig deeper into this, the real question is, okay, well, what is the non-manufacturer rule? What is the non-manufacturer rule, and how does the non-manufacturer rule directly apply under this new February 26, 2016 rule to ITVAR contracts? And so let's go to the next thing. So this is just further issues I already noted. Some of these things were 80-degree turns from what they said before. And what's important to note here as well is that as we go through some of these implications that are going to happen based on the non-manufacturer rule, that this rule applies prospectively only. We do not believe that this would apply retroactively to contracts that were solicited prior to February 26th, 2016. So it's not something that you need to sort of worry about or panic about how to deal with current contracts. For current contracts, you should just keep it as business as usual and run it the way that you were running it before.
And I just want to chime in on the prospective application versus retroactive, just to make sure we're clear that that's our interpretation. The rule itself isn't clear one way or the other. The rule does not say definitively this only applies prospectively or it also applies retroactively. It doesn't say either way. The way that a size standard works, and when they change a size standard, that only applies to future procurements issued under that size standard. So that's the reason why our interpretation is what they've done here is they've changed the size standard essentially for the ITVAR NAICS code. So that change should only apply to future procurements under the ITVAR size standard. There is a counterpoint to that argument though, which is what they've really done here is not so much change the size standard for ITVARs, but to change the performance requirement for ITVAR contracts and to say you have to qualify as a non-manufacturer, which, you know, arguably a performance requirement then is something that an agency could determine they want to enforce on existing contracts. I don't think so. That seems unlikely. We're just trying to come up with the counterpoint here to show you both sides of the issue, and we think the much stronger and better side of that issue is to say that it only applies prospectively, not to current, you know, already issued contracts. But that's one of the points of clarification that we'd like to get through this process and working with SBA and maybe on the Hill is to try to just get it, make sure we're on the same page here, that we all agree this only applies prospectively.
Yeah, thank you, John. and so going forward as to what is the non-manufacturer rule, why is it important here? And essentially, the non-manufacturer rule arose because you only have two types of contracts under the NAICS code system and the small business system. Supply contracts, which are essentially manufacturing contracts, and that's the way the rules are set up. You put manufacturing codes on any contract for supplies. And then you have service contracts where there are service codes. So in order to allow contractors to perform on these supply/manufacturing contracts, even if they didn't own factories and actually manufacture products, they created this non-manufacturer rule. And there are certain requirements to the non-manufacturer rule that come into play that sort of supplant the standard performance of work rules. So if you're performing a contract under the non-manufacturer or where the non-manufacturer rule applies, so essentially any contract for supplies that's a small business set aside where you are not the manufacturer of the end product, then instead of the performance of work rules, the standard performance of work rules, you have to follow these rules. First, in order to be small, you cannot exceed 500 employees. And this is where we noted before there's some confusion as to, well, the non-manufacturer rule applies in its entirety. Does the 500 employee size standard apply, or does the 150 employee size standard apply that's on the actual 541519 footnote 18 exception to the rule? And that can be very important because I know for a lot of small businesses, these ITVAR or frankly any sort of value-added reseller type of company, you can operate with very few employees. And so if you had an ITVAR company with 450 employees versus 100 employees, that can be a very, very different company. In fact, 450, you could be running, billions of dollars a year. So we would like some clarification as to which thing really applies here. Further, you have to be primarily engaged in the retail or wholesale trade in the items that you're providing. That's fairly standard. We'd be happy to answer any questions, but as long as that's sort of what you do, if your business is providing these types of items, you're generally covered under that on a regular basis. You have to take ownership or possession of the items with your personnel, equipment, or facilities in a manner consistent with industry practice. And in the context of the ITVAR contracts, what's important to know here is that OHA, the SBA's Office of Hearings and Appeals, has okayed the use of what they call drop shipping or FOB destination type of shipping methods or purchasing methods. So long as you're either taking ownership at some point in the supply chain or you're taking possession at some point in the supply chain, you meet this requirement. You do not have to take ownership and possession. It's ownership or possession. And in the context of FOB destination, the way we often seen it work is that either once it's shipped and delivered to the customer site, but before the customer accepts the product, the ownership, the title to that transfers to the VAR company, the reseller. And so in that sort of circumstance, you would be meeting the ownership prong, not necessarily the possession prong, but that should be fine. And now, for the last requirement of the non-manufacturer rule, and the most important or the most problematic that we see, especially in the ITVAR market, is that the supplies, the products you're delivering to the government, they have to be the end product of a small business manufacturer, unless a waiver is granted. We'll get into the waiver stuff in a minute. But first, the big thing is that the products have to be manufactured by a small business. In the ITVAR context, that generally means if there's equipment being delivered, the equipment has to be manufactured in factories essentially owned by small businesses and by a small business company, or in the context of software, that software has to be developed by a small business developer. And that's problematic, as most of you already probably know, and your lights are probably going off, but in the government contracting space, as with many large entities, the federal government is no different, they're looking for specific software and hardware solutions in order to get their work done and in order to integrate the new products seamlessly in with their old products. And so what happens is they want Cisco, they want Microsoft, certain like SharePoint, right? All these things, that's what they want, and that's what they want to buy. And unfortunately for a lot of small businesses now, those products that the government is buying tend to be made by large businesses. So they are not end products manufactured by a small business, in which case you cannot qualify as a non-manufacturer, small business non-manufacturer, under 541519, the ITVAR NAICS code, footnote 18, that exception, unless you are providing some other product that is developed by a small business or manufactured by a small business. And the fact of the matter is, in a lot of circumstances, the government is not interested in acquiring such products. Now, maybe there's room, maybe this is going to open up room in the industry for those products, but more likely than not, the government will simply state that these products cannot be, they require large business products, they cannot be supplied by a small business due to the application of the non-manufacturer rule to this ITVAR exception, and therefore the contracts do not need to go as small business set-asides because nobody can perform that work. So, but there are exceptions to the non-manufacturer rule. So what are some of those exceptions? And these exceptions are separate from the waivers. So waivers, like we'll get into a little bit later, sort of they waive that entire last requirement that you supply the end item of a small business. It's possible for the government on a contract basis or for a whole class of products to waive that entirely. But assuming that has not been waived, there are exceptions. So, for instance, if a contract is predominantly for services, then it's not a supply contract, i.e. manufacturing contract, and therefore the non-manufacturer rule doesn't even apply. So you don't have to worry about it. You just provide the services as you were providing it. And I'll note here that in 2002, SBA basically relied upon that exception to the non-manufacturer rule to say that these ITVAR procurements, while not predominantly for services on a cost perspective, they are predominantly for services so far as a importance of the products or services being supplied to the government. Those services were of critical importance, so they looked at that as being a service contract. And that's really where the major change occurred between 2002 and 2014, 2016. The non-manufacturer also does not apply to full and open procurements because in that case you're competing with large businesses and there essentially are no performance of work requirements. So the non-manufacturer rule, being a sort of type of performance of work requirement, falls by the wayside. It doesn't technically apply to subcontracts. So if you are a subcontractor, you don't have to necessarily abide by the non-manufacturer rule. And also for supply manufacturing procurements that are under the simplified acquisition threshold or use simplified acquisition procedures, or set aside orders under full and open multiple award contracts. So let's say you have a multiple award contract where it was open to large businesses and small businesses, and they decide under that one contract vehicle to set aside an order for small businesses. If that is valued at less than $25,000, so these sort of almost micro purchases, not quite micro, but close, then those sort of purchases are exempted. But they have to be under the $25,000 threshold. And the broader exemption is that small business set-aside contracts for these manufacturing products, for products that are between $3,000 and $150,000, that's the simplified acquisition threshold, these non-manufacturer rules do not apply. So if you have a contract for ITVAR services and supplies under 541, 519, the exemption, that's $149,000, you do not have to worry about this rule. I'll say though that has to be sort of on a good faith basis. The government can't make purchases every week of $150,000 week after week after week after week after week. That's generally frowned upon, and some contracting officers have gotten in trouble for doing just that in the past, and it can also blow back on you. So just be careful of things like that. There's some SBA rules that are coming out shortly that would confirm these exceptions. And what's also very important, I think John will get into some of this stuff later too, is that the SBA thinks that there are certain items, mainly commercial software, where the waiver rules and maybe some sort of exemption should apply and should become broader, which could be very helpful to you. And they want to spur more small business spending for the supply of these brand name products as well. So in that case, if you're providing certain computers or certain hardware equipment that's not already part of a class waiver, which again, John will get into, that already exempts you from these rules, SBA wants to expand upon that a little bit, and we'll see how that develops as the rules come out, and hopefully we get a chance to work with SBA here. John and I and others here at the firm are more than happy to work with them to maybe come up with a way to, perhaps that's where we could soften some of this stuff. And also there's a question on how this new rule, the new application of the non-manufacturer rule, is actually going to apply to orders under federal supply schedules and multiple award contracts. Given that normally you apply or don't apply the non-manufacturer rule at the contract level, is it a contract for supplies or is it a contract for services? Then if the overall contract, the IDIQ vehicle, is for, say, services, but you have ITVAR tasks that come out. Should the non-manufacturer rule really apply to those tasks or not is an open question. And the same for federal supply contracts, where usually task order by task order, they're viewed differently than tasks under a MAC or an IDIQ. So there could be differences between ITVAR task orders under a federal supply schedule, where maybe SBA could say that this new non-manufacturer rule applies to those ITVAR tasks versus under some of the MACs and IDIQ contracts where it might not. But that's still sort of an open issue, a pending issue, something that we're going to have to look into and pay attention to as we go forward.
All right, thanks, Cy. So we're about halfway through the presentation, and I think it's a good point to sort of pause and recap where we're at to this point. Let you fire in some questions if you want to. I think we've thrown a lot of good information at you, but I find the non-manufacturer rule to be confusing, and we do this every day, and it's a rule that I have to read it every time it becomes an issue just to make sure I've got it down in my head how it works. So where we're at to this point in the presentation is that this new rule, effective as of February 26th, says that ITVARs have to comply with the non-manufacturer rule. And the most important component of that compliance means you have to supply the product of another small business. So when you're selling an HP printer or Microsoft software, that's obviously not manufactured by a small business. So one of the things you're trying to do is look to see if one of these exceptions might apply, that you could get around the non-manufacturer rule based on one of these exceptions. So that's why Cy's laid out the exceptions. And the other way we could avoid the non-manufacturer rule when we're selling HP printers or Microsoft software is if we could get a waiver. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Before I dive into waivers, though, let me address a question that came in. Somebody asked, what does the new rule mean for orders competed under NASA SOUP? And does this mean that the government can buy only up to $25,000, which would be that existing exception threshold, in order to comply with the non-manufacturer rule? Well, I certainly can't speak for NASA on this, and I won't, but when I was at a conference back in February, right before this rule was going into effect, and there was somebody there from NASA, and I know that they were examining the new rule and figuring out what to do about it at that time. And sort of the off-the-record feedback I got was that they were glad to hear that our view is that the rule applies only prospectively, not retroactively. So I think what that means is that they were looking at applying it to a future procurement, but not already awarded contracts. So maybe that would be a future iteration of the SOUP vehicle, but not the existing SOUP vehicle. Again, I'm not speaking for NASA on that. I don't know where they landed. The last I heard, it was in flux, but I would be hopeful that most agencies would take the similar view that this really should apply only prospectively to future contracts as opposed to vehicles that are already awarded. Okay, so let's talk about waivers then. So there's two types of waivers. I think Cy alluded to this. They're individual waivers and there are class waivers. So if you're an ITVAR, and we're living with this new rule now because we don't have any choice until we can maybe change it or get some some helpful interpretations and clarifications. So if we're living with this new rule, then waivers are our best friend. We need to understand the waiver process and how we might be able to go about getting waivers. What exactly does that mean and entail? Because we're going to need them in this new world that we're living in. So individual waivers apply to a particular contract. Individual waivers are approved by SBA. They have to be requested by the contracting officer. And there is no particular format that the contracting officer has to use in putting it together, but generally speaking, they got to make a case that there's no small business manufacturer that can reasonably be expected to offer the product meeting specifications of that contract. So, again, this is a contract-specific issue, and it's, I think, frankly, between the two, it's probably a little bit more likely that it's probably going to be more beneficial to the ITVAR community to get individual waivers, because as we talk about class waivers in a few slides, I think it's going to be a challenge to figure out how do we get class waivers in place for the products that you ITVARs are selling on a regular basis, and how many of those waivers could we realistically expect to get in place on a class basis. So class waivers would be more of a home run for us if we could get them, but I think they're going to be harder to get. So these contract-specific individual waivers are probably going to be where we're really getting our benefit out of the waiver process as ITVARs. And because they have to be done by the contracting officer, requested by the CO and approved by the SBA, that's part of the challenge for us in the ITVAR community, is that we can't directly get an individual waiver. We can push our contracting officers, and we can try to make it as easy as possible for the contracting officers to go get the waiver, but ultimately we need the contracting officers to be interested and willing to do this process on a contract by contract basis. So what does that process entail? I mean, I think it's helpful, even though you as an ITVAR cannot ask for an individual waiver yourself, I think it's beneficial for you to understand the process, because you're probably going to be talking with contracting officers and OSDBUs and people like that at your customers, where you're trying to convince them you need to do an individual waiver for this project. We're not going to be able to sell to you as a small business if you can't get a waiver in place, because there is no small business manufacturer for Apple iPads or HP printers. So what happens is the contracting officer submits a request in writing to the SBA, and like I mentioned before, there's no particular format for the request, but it has to cover the bases that I've got listed here. There's got to be a statement of the specific item that's going to be waived and a justification for why the item is required. They need to include the solicitation number, the NAICS code, the dollar amount, and a brief statement of the procurement, and maybe a copy of the statement of work if the contract is large enough. And then they should have a determination with supporting information that there's no small business manufacturers or processors for the item. And this is where I think why it's easier to envision individual waivers as opposed to class waivers, because for an individual contract, the contracting officer could say, this requirement is for Microsoft software. So there cannot be anybody but Microsoft to supply this software. On a class waiver basis, we're talking about a particular type of software. It could be manufactured by a small business. It may not be, the most customers' preferred choice, but it's harder to say there's no manufacturer at all for an entire class of a product than it is for an individual contract. So again, that's why we see this as on a day-to-day basis, the more feasible way that we're going to work around this new requirement. And so I think what you want to gravitate towards is maybe teeing up like a template of an individual waiver request that this could be fed to contracting officers to facilitate them asking for a waiver. I mean, we're getting some questions coming in now. People are asking, isn't this a lot of work for the contracting officers? And are they going to be likely to do it? And I think that's a real legitimate concern about this new rule. That's one of the big things that we're worried about. I don't know if it makes a difference whether I think it's a lot of work, but I do believe that some contracting officers will view it as more work than they want to do, and that they don't have to do it. And there's actually been GAO case law recently that says that it's totally discretionary whether they decide to go for a waiver or not. So in the small business ITVAR community, we're not going to be able to protest their decision not to go for a waiver, which means that I think there's a real potential for adverse effect on the number of small business set-asides in this area if contracting officers just don't feel like going for waivers. So I think what we can do in industry is a couple things, and one of which is what I'm talking about here, which is really understand the individual waiver process and look at developing a template or trying to help streamline for the contracting officer. Look, submit this for the individual waiver. I'll make it easier for you. I'll help tee it up for you, what you need to submit to SBA. I'll walk you through the process, help you make your small business numbers, get this thing set aside, and we need to get an individual waiver to get it set aside. I think we could also look at trying to work with SBA on streamlining the waiver process, both in terms of what the contracting officer has to submit, how long the SBA takes to process it. I don't know how often the waiver process has been utilized historically, but I think we're going to see a real uptick in the use of the waiver processes now that it's going to impact the ITVAR community the way that it will. And so I'm not sure if the current rules are ready for that. I see another question come in making a very good point, how much of a quick turnaround there is for procurement, that how long are agencies going to be willing to wait for the SBA to issue a waiver? And so I think we need to tighten up the processes related to how waivers work. And the good news is, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, SBA has signaled in a recent rulemaking, which will hopefully be finalized later this year, that they understand the need for more waivers, and they're trying to facilitate more waivers for things like name brand software. They actually have some pending proposals that would do just that. So I think they recognize that in this new world we're living in, we're going to need more from the waiver processes. They're going to need to work better and be clearer than maybe they are right now. But there are definitely concerns here. So everybody who's submitting comments and concerns, I think you're absolutely right. We're hitting on a big area of concern, the feasibility of individual waivers, and what can we do if the government just doesn't want to do it. There really isn't a lot of recourse right now other than just try to make it as easy as possible for them, or try to get class waivers. And that's the slide that's just popping up for you now. The other type of waiver is the class waiver. And this applies to an entire class of products. And I've got some of the details on here about how the SBA rules would define when a class waiver is appropriate, when there's no small business manufacturers available in the federal market for a class of products. So I think you can start to get a sense in looking over this information here of why I was saying before it's not going to be easy to get class waivers for a lot of the products, because there probably is a small business manufacturer out there for a lot of this stuff that the government is typically buying name brand, but nevertheless, to get a class waiver, we've got to say that, there aren't any small businesses that have been awarded a contract or submitted an offer to supply the class of product within the last 2 years. And that's going to be a difficult showing to make. But the advantage of the class waiver process is that industry can initiate this. SBA can do it also. And so we have the ability to try to influence the issuance of class waivers, either by asking SBA or by submitting it ourselves. So I think it's important to understand, and again, the rules probably could use a little tightening on how the class waiver process is going to work, timelines, et cetera. But there is some information in the rules right now, and I've summarized it here. You know, what do you need to do to get a class waiver? Typical small business probably isn't going to be in a great position or have the time and resources to provide detailed information on the efforts to identify small business manufacturers or processors for the class. I mean, you're going to, you know, you could check SAM and check other databases, and that's probably not sufficient level of examination for SBA's purposes. So the typical small business may not be able to build a very strong case here. This is where I think maybe there's an opportunity for banding together. I think industry, we really need to focus on this, and we need these new rules that are coming out from SBA hopefully later this year, where they're supposed to be recognizing and hopefully making it a little bit easier for the waiver processes to be implemented. We really need to focus on that, and if the waiver processes have kinks in them still, and I suspect they probably will, then we need to really push on improving the waiver process, because the advantage of the class waiver is that we don't have to depend on the contracting officer whether they feel like doing it. Once we get a class waiver in place, it's in place and it applies to that product, and then anytime somebody buys that product, we don't have to worry about individual waivers, and we don't have to worry about the non-manufacturer rule.
One thing just to add really quickly is that back in 2002, when they first created the footnote 18 exception, SBA found that ITVAR contracts are not performed by small business manufacturers, because they found that there weren't small business manufacturers for a lot of these items. And so to the extent that there's any sort of argument or people thinking that, well, the ITVAR, the reseller market might be harmed, but the manufacturer market for small business would be helped because the government will buy some of these things. Well, SBA already looked, at least in 2002, and said there aren't people out there that'll do it. And B, I think it's a very real concern or thought that the government isn't necessarily going to just start buying a bunch of non-brand name equipment just because they want to comply with the small business rules. It's much more likely that they'll just simply order on a full and open basis the same stuff that they've been ordering. So I just wanted to mention that, so there's some support back in the old rules for the fact that there should maybe be class waivers for some things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in terms of the existing class waivers, I've got the link here for you to go check out what waivers exist right now. There are some waivers in place for products that at least arguably would fall within the ITVAR sphere. So I think it's worth checking out to see if the types of things that you're regularly reselling are already covered by a waiver. Saw that somebody made a comment that they try to steer their work, their contracting officers and their projects towards codes that already have existing class waivers, and I think that's a very smart strategy. For projects that are already awarded under the ITVAR code, I don't think it would be worthwhile to try to change the code for an already awarded contract. First of all, I don't think you could do that, and second of all, our position would be this new rule doesn't apply to already awarded contracts. But going forward, yeah, another strategy would absolutely be to try to steer this work either to a services code or to a manufacturing code that already has a class waiver in place. 541, 519, I don't know that there'll ever be a class waiver specifically for 541, 519, because the way that class waivers work is that they apply to the manufacturing code for the product that's being waived. So what I'm hopeful, but this is not clear in the rules, I'm hopeful that the SBA would say, if you are buying a product under 541519 that has an existing class waiver for the manufacturing code, that class waiver applies when you're buying it under 541519. That seems like a common sense approach, but the rules aren't clear on that. So that's another point that we'd be looking to try to clarify, and hopefully, that'll, at least the waivers we can get under manufacturing codes, you'd be able to benefit from those waivers when you're using 541519. So I've alluded to this pending rulemaking here. We just have a slide that gives you some more details on what the SBA has proposed to do. That they're trying to facilitate class waivers for name brand software, and the proposal was to do it under 511210. Again, it's not clear how do we line this up with software that might be resold under 541519, and it's not clear from the rulemaking, how quickly do we think we might be able to get these waivers in place, but at least it's a starting point, which may not be great comfort, but it's it's a move in the right direction. I think we're just going to have to push harder to have it be more of a benefit. Some other pending changes to the waivers process I've highlighted on the next slide, that contracting officers would be required to notify potential offerors when there's a class or individual waiver applicable. And they could grant waivers after the solicitation is issued, as long as everybody has enough time to respond. I mean, those both seem like kind of no-brainer proposals that hopefully will be finalized. The ability to grant waivers after contract award for in-scope modifications. So again, keep an eye out. Maybe by the summertime, probably more likely by the fall, around the time of the end of the current government fiscal year, we may see these proposed rules issued as a final rule, and then we'll have to dive in and figure out what are they actually finalizing, and that's definitely another point that our firm will be putting out some information for everybody.
All right, now, kind of the last part here, sort of coming towards the end of things, we just wanted to reiterate, and this is a nice slide to kind of show you where things have gone through some of the policy issues. And, there's been inconsistent treatment, right, from between 2002 and now. Like I said before, in 2002, SBA explicitly said that non-manufacturer rule does not apply, because essentially it is a service code 541519, and that even with the footnote 18 exception, the services portion are critically important. While maybe not the most valuable from a monetary perspective, they are the most valuable piece of these ITVAR contracts, because without those value added portions, it's simply dropping, boxes off of equipment that the government may or may not know how to use, and they may or may not know how to integrate into their own systems. So without that, it's essentially worthless. So the supplies are very important. In 2012, SBA reiterated that non-manufacturer should not apply to service codes, and 541519 is a service code. So in the general sense, again, that's sort of points to the fact that it should not apply in these sort of circumstances. In 2014, there was some problematic issues where SBA proposed to eliminate the exception, kind of going back on some of its interpretations from 2002 and 2012 as they re-looked at things. And more problematic as well, the Court of Federal Claims issued a rule based upon the non-manufacturer language in the Small Business Act itself as opposed to the regulations, the law passed by Congress, and they said that that rule applies to all contracts, service or supply. Although shortly thereafter, it was the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed and issued in 2015, they overturned that case. Congress and the President overturned that case and said, no, we're amending the Small Business Act to make it clear that it doesn't apply to service codes. So now we're essentially back, at that point, we're back to 2012 when SBA reiterated that it should not apply to service codes. And again, 541519 is a service code. So Moving forward to 2016, though, SBA continues to evaluate the ITVAR issues. They decide not to eliminate the exception, but instead they want to apply the non-manufacturer rule, which raises some of these problematic issues, especially with the GAO ruling that I think John noted, where essentially what GAO said is if there isn't a class waiver, or maybe it was implied if there isn't a class waiver, then it's not mandatory. You don't have to necessarily look at non-manufacturers to determine whether small businesses can perform the work. You merely have to look and say, okay, if there is no waiver in place for the products that I want, then are there any small businesses that can provide these products, can provide me with the end product of a small business for these products? If you're buying Microsoft Office, the answer is always going to be no, because only Microsoft produces or codes Microsoft Office. So there is never going to be a small business that can manufacture that. It's against copyright law. Can't do it. And so in those circumstances, GAO said that that's the end of the analysis. You don't have to look and see whether there are non-manufacturers out there, ITVAR companies, that could come in and do this work if you, the contracting officer, go through the process of getting the waiver. That process is completely discretionary, so you can end your analysis at I'm buying Microsoft Office, done, go to a large business. And that, in conjunction with some of these other issues we've discussed, we think creates a problem for small businesses here that needs to be rectified by SBA, or at least clarified that is this really what was intended. And also through Congress and people on the Hill maybe getting some lobbying efforts together, it's likely that, or hopefully likely, that some of the representatives would see that this is a major issue. And there's a lot of companies that have grown up since 2002 to provide these ITVAR services. And without them, there's job losses, there's tax loss, revenue losses, there's a lot of things that could occur. And so the rules should be changed, and the ITVAR exception in its full and most powerful form should be brought back, maybe through an amendment to the Small Business Act. And in addition, we need some of these clarifications to the waivers, as John mentioned.
Thanks, Si. So, last slide here, and then we're about to wrap up, and we've covered all these points. So it's really just a summary of what can we do at this point in the ITVAR community? Obviously understand and utilize the exceptions and the waiver processes. That's, knowledge is power here, and these are the tools that we have at our disposal. I think a lot of the comments that we've gotten are good, and we agree wholeheartedly. These tools are not going to completely solve the issue for ITVARs, but they're the tools that we have to work with right now. We need to understand and be able to use them while we're also focusing on trying to get some better tools, which is, what we have covered later on the slide here. And that's part of what we're going to do. So we're going to take all of your good feedback. I encourage you to keep submitting stuff to us. So when we close this out, send us an email. We've got both of our email addresses here on the screen. Everybody who participated will get a copy of the slides emailed to you. So again, you'll get the email address again that way. Just encourage you to give us our feedback, because we're going to be looking to send something to SBA and maybe to the House Small Business Committee soon on this, and we want your help in fleshing that out. Just before we run, I think we answered most of the questions, but I wanted to address one that if there are any that we missed, I promise we'll follow up with you individually by email afterwards. But I can see one here that I don't think we addressed, asking whether if there's a class waiver, does that mean you can sell the end item manufactured by a foreign business? So what the SBA is doing in the proposed rule that should be finalized later this year is making clear that a waiver of the non-manufacturer rule does not change any of the other requirements that apply to the project. So if there's a Buy America Act obligation, for example, you still have to comply with that even though there's a class waiver. So the class waiver just impacts application of the non-manufacturer rule. And we just got a late addition here. The threshold is 150 employees for ITVARs. But that's a point of confusion. That's another point of clarification that we want to clear up. That's why we said, does this change effectively eliminate the 150 employee size standard and make it a 500 employee size standard, because we're saying ITVARs have to comply with the non-manufacturer rule now. I think what SBA would say is you have to comply with the non-manufacturer rule, but the non-manufacturer rule is modified for 541519, meaning that for 541519, it's not a 500 employee size standard, it's 150 employee size standard. But that's not clear in the rule, so that's another thing, area that we'll be looking to try to get some clarity on. So thanks everybody for your questions and your time, really appreciate it. I hope to hear from you again on this subject, and we'll be in touch.